Okay, so someone asked me, you're so interested in decadence, like what makes you not decadent? And what's immunized you was how they put it against decadence. Now, the first thing I'd say is I have decadence running through me. We all do. Those of us in this postmodern world, we all have a degree of decadence. I certainly have habits that I regard as decadent still. Behaviors, again, for me, there's a sort of leaning into the wholesome, and then some days I lose that battle. Certainly not perfect. However, there's been certain features in my life that I've been in some ways lucky, in some ways I necessitated them, in some ways unlucky, in some ways I chose them, and maybe going through something that I thought could be useful. So this is what's made me more immune to decadence. I think most people, and I'm going to pick a couple of my friends as examples as well. I'm pretty sure they won't mind. If you don't have those features, why you might want to be a bit careful. Okay, so what's immunized me? The first one is I hit the limits of decadence pretty quickly as someone who was personally inclined towards that. My dad is an alcoholic. I think I have alcoholic addictive genes. Those kind of pleasure-seeking genes were always there in me, even as a kid. And I used to look after kids, and you see this, I used to do school discos for groups of kids, right? You have 200 kids having a good time, and then have a sweet shop, and some kids would buy some sweets and eat it, and some kids would just buy loads of sweets, eat them, be sick, and then eat more sweets, right? They'd have an addictive quality around the sugar. Used to really see that. So I think there was a genetic component for me that made me vulnerable to decadence, but that meant that I hit that rock bottom much earlier. So, my rock bottom for me was I'd just come back from working in some war zone, and I was full of tapeworms. I had worms crawling out of me, and I was so alcoholic. I was meant to be looking after my mum, so I was staying at her house, but she didn't need that much. She had a tumor at the time, and she didn't really need a whole lot. So I was basically just living in a house rent-free, and I was playing computer games all day long to distract myself from lack of purpose while drinking all night long with tapeworms crawling out of me. And I crashed a car. Not drunk, but certainly slightly sort of, wouldn't say suicidal, but had that urge. And I really thought to myself, maybe I should just kill myself, And I had hit that rock bottom. And I thought, well, if I'm going to die, I feel like shit. I look like shit. And I was pretty young. Was it 27, 28? And that's the point where I decided to get sober. But I was lucky that I'd kind of hit that rock bottom so young. Much younger than my dad did. He got sober much later in life. And so you could say, I was fortunate to have fucked up so much so early. The one thing that did really help me, though, was a lot of martial arts training. So that gave me a counterpoint to decadence. The rigorous training I didn't really get in my childhood from my, absent dad and my liberal mother was in martial arts. I had a lot of good male role models, particularly, that really took care of me. In the martial arts for when I was young. A lot of good mentors, people like Paul Linden, Don Levine, some people are dead now, some people I'm still in touch with. And I was very lucky to have those. And I think seeing successful men who had got their shit together, that was really helpful. Several of them were Jewish, and I think that had an influence on me as well. They were from sort of refugee families whose families had survived the Holocaust and had a sort of different view on life. So the martial arts training, definitely one. I did some stuff when I was a kid, some military cadet stuff. If I look at my main work colleague at the moment, Matt Hill, he was in the British military. He also had martial arts training. A couple of guys that I really respect as non-decadent I've been speaking to today, last week actually. One, Miles Kessler, again, military training. And he had very hardcore meditation training, which I also had later in life. And that, I think, makes you look at your relationship to pleasure, builds that discipline once again. So martial arts and meditation training, they're really, they're very, very, very good for avoiding decadence, I would say. So getting over the alcoholism, 12-step group, that was a big one for me, finding wholesome pleasures. And then, I developed sort of compulsive sexuality when I was sober from alcohol. And again, sorting that out therapeutically, I was lucky at that point to have enough money for a therapist. That, I think, was another major step forward for me. And gave me some more like, okay, there's kind of one of the major ones for a lot of guys, and to some extent you just grow out of that as a guy as well, right? It's different in your 40s. That drive is less there. The other one is Ukraine. So I was in Ukraine setting up a trauma charity last year, and Ukraine's really fighting for the West. It's really fighting for the West, to be part of the West. and rather than another culture. Now, there's all these conspiracy theories. Oh, it's the CIA, blah, 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 blah. But, you know, the truth of the matter is Ukrainians saw, they looked left, they looked right, and they went, you know what, I'd rather be in the West. And that's the truth of it. And support for Russia just fell away the more exposure people had to the lifestyle of the West and the way of the West. So I think seeing people really fight for to be part of the West made a big impact on me. And previous to that, I'd had a lot of experience in Poland, in Russia, in Ukraine. You know, before the war, I had a lot of experience. I met my wife in Ukraine, she's Ukrainian. And, you know, that experience of Eastern Europe, I think they don't have this sort of post-colonial guilt in Eastern Europe. And they're just a bit tougher. You know, my closest Aikido friend is a Polish guy called Pietra. And he was just always a bit tougher than me. And I was like, okay, East Europeans are tough people. They don't mess around. And they're not decadent in the same way. Sometimes they flip too far the other way and go kind of far right, for example, but not very often. Like Poland, for example, is like anti-fascist, anti-communist, yeah, on the whole. So, yeah, I think the East European influence was another really big one on me. One last really big one on me, I think, was just travel. So I have traveled a lot. Lived in Ethiopia, lived in the slums of Brazil, spent a lot of time in Israel, a lot of time in Russia, a lot of time in Ukraine. I've lived in the Alps. I've lived in, you know, I've visited every European country except I think Albania and Liechtenstein. Is there one more of the tiny ones, Monaco or somewhere. I've taught all over the world, you know, in Japan and Singapore and India and blah, blah. And I think all that travel made me go, wow, I'm really lucky. So gratitude is often the missing emotion of the West for young people who don't understand what they've got. They haven't read enough history. That's another major immunization factor for me. I'm an avid non-professional, but, you know, I'm a historian. I love history. That's like one of my main hobbies. If I have a spare weekend, I'll be watching a documentary on Alexander the Great or the samurai or some shit like that, right? That's how I got into this whole decadence thing, because I was, you know, studying Rome and Greece. So yeah, love history. And I think history plus travel means you have perspective. So it's easy to criticize the West from within the West. But when you're in Afghanistan, you're like, what do you mean you rape small boys here? That's not very nice. Or fuck, why is there no infrastructure here? And you after a while you go, well, this isn't that colonialism took all the money and destroyed everything. That's bullshit. You just read history and you go, that's just not the case. It's an excuse, you know, because there's certain countries that really blossomed after, you know, various South American ones or Asian ones, Singapore being an example. They just blossomed. So yeah, that's not really the case that it's that somehow colonialism ruined everywhere, or else there'd be, you know, everywhere would be Wakanda or whatever Hollywood makes up. So as you know, I was immunized. So when I heard the social justice thing start coming in, I go, well, that's not true because I've read history, or, you know, this Hollywood movie that's a misrepresentation. That didn't actually happen like that. Yeah. So I think that really helps. I mean, Hollywood definitely has an agenda. And, you know, there's been various examples of this recently with Cleopatra, or is it the woman queen or whatever it is. Anyway, the woman who in reality was a slave trader, and now in, you know, Hollywood is made this kind of noble, heroic person. So once you've read a bit of history, traveled a bit, you've got a point of comparison. And I often think all the people complaining about the West should just travel more. It's like, go abroad, look around. It's not to say that I don't admire things of other cultures. I've admired the Eastern European side. You know, I've got a lot from Japanese culture. I really admire the Japanese. I've got a lot from Japanese culture. I find it very noble and a lot to be admired. You know, I learned passion in Brazil. You know, Brazil's like borderline West. You could say South America's half Western. Got a lot from that passionate South Americanness that I had lost being North European. So as ever, I find a lot in other cultures. Ethiopia is another one that I lived, a place I lived and admired in many ways. And my general view coming back was like, you know what? We're actually really lucky in the West. And you know what? My actual values are Western values. Yeah, whether it be the sort of civic rule of law, democracy, the right of the individual, the spiritual nature of the individual rather than the collective. You know, so much I've looked at now and I've gone, wow, we're so lucky. So yeah, read more history. And this is my always my, if people say I hate the West, I'm like, read more history and travel more. You know, come back and apologize to your father. Yeah. So yeah, I think that immunized me along with this, you know, hardcore martial arts and meditation practice. A few good mentors who wouldn't let me hate the West, you know, whose parents had fled as refugees from the West. And I think they're probably the main factors. A certain bloody mindedness. I'd say personality wise, I have very low agreeableness on the what's called the big 5 personality trait psychometric. And that low agreeableness means I'm likely to argue something I think is right rather than try and fit in socially. So when everybody else is like, you know, going social justice and saying, oh, you should be anti-West, I'm going to argue that, I'm not sure about that. So that's just a personality one. So yeah, that's my story. I don't know what resonates for you. I'd be genuinely interested to see what else resonates for people. You know, was it a good dad? Was it a great wife? You know, like certainly there's been some women in my life who have encouraged me, East European women. Actually, I've got one German colleague who always brings out the best in me around these topics of decadence, who just inspired me to be less decadent. So that's, you know, good friends, or maybe part of your story. Maybe it was certain practices that were part of your story. I really want to know this actually, because I don't want to know what in my own story is just random and what maybe we can generalize. Maybe we can go, right, this should be something we get the youth doing. You know, I love martial arts, for example, to be just a mandatory part of the British education system. Like that, you know, if I ruled Britain, if I was Prime Minister of Britain, that's one thing I would install right away. It's like mandatory martial arts in school, like the Japanese have. But, you know, maybe I just got lucky with that. So what do you think?